My daughter Samantha is not someone who attracts attention by design. That is what made her so effective during her 18 years in the military. As one of the first women selected for Delta Force, she learned to blend in, to appear unremarkable despite her extraordinary capabilities. When she retired last spring with multiple commendations and classified missions that will never appear in any public record, all she wanted was peace and quiet. Samantha purchased her house in Oak Ridge Estates while still deployed overseas. She had saved diligently throughout her career and wanted something permanent after nearly 2 decades of temporary barracks and forward operating bases. The real estate photos showed manicured lawns, a community pool, and the privacy of a gated entrance. It seemed perfect for transitioning to civilian life. I helped coordinate the purchase remotely. The housing market was competitive, and she did not want to lose her chance at the modest 3-bedroom ranch house with the large backyard where she planned to plant a vegetable garden and finally adopt the dog she had always wanted. The hefty homeowners association fees seemed reasonable for the amenities provided. Neither of us realized we were buying into what essentially functioned as a small authoritarian regime. The first warning signs appeared on moving day. Samantha had barely begun unloading her sparse belongings when a gold-badged security guard in a navy blue uniform approached with a clipboard. He introduced himself as Dennis, part of the Oak Ridge Safety and Compliance team. He proceeded to inform her that her moving truck was parked 3 inches too far from the curb, a violation that would result in a warning this time, but would incur a $50 fine for future infractions. Samantha, accustomed to military precision, simply nodded and moved the truck. That evening, she received her first official notice under her door. Her temporary storage pod in the driveway needed to be removed within 24 hours rather than the standard 3 days allowed in the HOA guidelines. The notice was signed by Margaret Holloway, HOA president. The next morning, Samantha awoke to find someone photographing her house from the street. When she opened her front door, an older woman with immaculately styled silver hair and a gold pin that read HOA president introduced herself without smiling. Margaret Holloway conducted what she called a welcome inspection, pointing out that Samantha's mailbox was not the approved shade of forest green, but rather hunter green, a violation that would need immediate correction. Within a week, Samantha had received 4 more citations for infractions ranging from improper trash bin placement to unauthorized wind chimes. When she consulted the 78-page HOA manual, she discovered that many of these supposed violations were either not listed or fell within permitted guidelines. But each time she attempted to address this discrepancy through proper channels, her inquiries went unanswered. I advised patience during our weekly phone calls. "Give it time," I said. "Every community has an adjustment period." What neither of us understood yet was that this was not random bureaucratic confusion. The excessive scrutiny of her property coincided with increasingly frequent patrols past her house. Security vehicles would slow down, guards taking photos and making notes as they passed. Samantha tried to maintain a low profile, the same strategy that had served her well during operations in hostile territory. She attended HOA meetings, followed protocols, and kept her military background private. But something about her presence had clearly unsettled the established order of Oak Ridge Estates. Perhaps it was her self-sufficiency, her quiet confidence, or simply that she asked clarifying questions when handed arbitrary directives. Whatever the reason, Margaret Holloway and her security team had marked my daughter as a potential threat to their authority. As the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that Samantha's perfect retirement plan had landed her in contested territory. The battle lines were being drawn, though only my daughter with her combat experience recognized the signs of impending conflict. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Margaret Holloway and the system she had constructed at Oak Ridge Estates. Before becoming HOA president, Margaret had attempted to launch a political career, running unsuccessfully for city council twice and county commissioner once. Public service was never her goal, power was. When conventional political avenues failed her, she found her domain in the 120-home development where regulations could be written, enforced, and modified with minimal oversight. Margaret had been president for 7 years when Samantha moved in. During that time, she had systematically replaced every board member with loyal allies, usually friends or neighbors who benefited from selective enforcement of community guidelines. Her most significant innovation, however, was the creation of the Oak Ridge Safety and Compliance Team, a security force that went far beyond the typical HOA enforcement mechanisms. The team consisted of 5 men, most former security guards or failed police academy applicants who had found in Oak Ridge Estates the authority they craved, but could not earn elsewhere. They drove custom golf carts painted with official-looking emblems and wore tailored Navy uniforms with gold badges that closely resembled law enforcement insignia, without quite crossing legal boundaries for impersonation. What most residents did not realize was that these men carried concealed firearms while on patrol, a fact Margaret privately encouraged despite having absolutely no legal authority to create an armed security force. The HOA bylaws had been amended 3 times under her leadership, each revision granting her security team expanded powers, including the ability to issue immediate fines without board review and to enter properties for emergency compliance inspections, with minimal notice. The Wilson family learned the consequences of challenging this authority when they questioned a $300 fine for unauthorized holiday decorations. Within a week, they received notices for 7 additional violations. Their teenage son was banned from the community pool for disruptive behavior that no one witnessed. Their garbage collection was mysteriously missed for 3 consecutive weeks. When Mr. Wilson reported suspicious scratches on his car, security concluded there was insufficient evidence, despite the incident occurring directly under a community camera. Meanwhile, Margaret's close friend Diane Henderson maintained a front yard that violated at least 5 landscaping regulations, without receiving a single citation. The treasurer, Robert Phillips, had built an unauthorized shed that exceeded size limitations by 30%, but received a special exception during a closed board meeting. The Peterson family on Maple Drive endured 6 months of escalating harassment after Mrs. Peterson spoke against a fee increase at a community meeting. Security vehicles parked outside their home at night, lights shining into their windows. Anonymous complaints about noise and odors triggered repeated inspections. When they finally put their house on the market, potential buyers received anonymous letters warning about problem neighbors and pending special assessments. Most residents simply complied to avoid becoming targets. They paid their fines without question, attended mandatory community functions, and kept their opinions private. Those who initially resisted quickly learned that Margaret's security team operated with complete impunity, and her network of informants meant that opposition was identified and squelched before it could organize. The community lived under constant surveillance. Security cameras at every street corner were ostensibly for safety, but primarily served as monitoring tools. Margaret received daily reports of suspicious activities that invariably included details about residents who had questioned policies or shown signs of discontent. The HOA Facebook group functioned as a propaganda platform, where Margaret would publicly praise compliant homeowners while making examples of violators. always careful to avoid using names while including enough details that everyone knew exactly who was being censured. This was the environment my daughter had unwittingly purchased into. An environment where power was concentrated, accountability was non-existent, and resistance was systematically punished. Margaret Holloway had created a perfect petty dictatorship, complete with informants, enforcers, and a terrified populace. What Margaret could not have known was that my daughter had spent her career dismantling more dangerous power structures in far more hostile environments. Samantha had been trained to recognize authoritarian systems, to identify their vulnerabilities, and when necessary, to neutralize their threats with precision and minimal collateral damage. The irony was that all Samantha wanted was to be left alone to enjoy her retirement. She had no interest in community politics or power struggles. But Margaret Holloway was about to learn a painful lesson about choosing the wrong adversary. As autumn settled over Oak Ridge Estates, Samantha began the process of making her house truly her own. After 18 years of living in spaces she could not modify, she was eager to implement some simple security enhancements that her military experience had taught her were prudent. None of these modifications would alter the exterior appearance of the home, but they would provide the peace of mind that someone with her background required. Following HOA protocols precisely, Samantha submitted detailed forms requesting permission to install reinforced door frames, specialized window locks, and a personal security system. Her requests included manufacturer specifications, confirmation that all modifications would be invisible from the street, and citations of the relevant HOA guidelines that permitted such changes when they did not affect community aesthetics. The response came not through the official channels but in person. Margaret Holloway appeared at her door, flanked by 2 security team members. Without preamble, Margaret informed Samantha that her requests had been unanimously denied by the Architectural Review Committee. When Samantha politely asked which specific guidelines her proposals had violated, Margaret responded with a thin smile. "The committee found your suggested modifications excessive and potentially concerning. We maintain certain standards in Oak Ridge Estates. Perhaps this community is not the right fit for someone with your specialized concerns." The implication was clear. Despite following every procedural requirement, Samantha was being denied rights explicitly permitted to other residents. 2 doors down, the Millers had installed an elaborate security system complete with visible cameras after a series of car break-ins the previous year. Margaret had personally approved their request within 48 hours. Within days, the security patrols past Samantha's home increased in frequency. Golf carts cruised by her house hourly, guards openly photographing her property and taking notes. When she left for her civilian job each morning, a security vehicle would often follow her to the community gate. On multiple occasions, she returned home to find fresh tire tracks on her lawn, always in spots visible from security patrol routes, but just out of range of her doorbell camera. The situation escalated dramatically one Saturday when Samantha was working in her backyard. She had barely begun planting a small herb garden when she heard her gate unlatch. 2 security guards entered her backyard without announcement, clipboards in hand. When she asked why they were on her property without permission, the taller guard, Dennis, informed her they were documenting landscape violations and did not require permission for compliance inspections. Samantha cited the HOA bylaws, which clearly stated that except in emergencies, residents must receive 24-hour notice before property inspections. Dennis smirked and continued photographing her yard. "President Holloway has declared your non-compliant garden an emergency situation due to potential impact on community standards. You will receive the citation by morning." That evening, Samantha drafted a formal complaint documenting the unauthorized entry and misapplication of emergency provisions. She delivered it to the HOA office drop box with copies to every board member. When she followed up 1 week later, the office administrator claimed no record of her complaint. 2 board members insisted they had never received copies. The third suggested that perhaps Samantha was confused about the procedures and should take time to adjust to community living. Meanwhile, Margaret began a whisper campaign. At the community coffee morning, which Samantha did not attend due to work commitments, Margaret expressed concerns about the new resident with possible PTSD issues. She mentioned military background and potential instability in the same carefully crafted sentences, never making direct accusations but planting seeds of fear and suspicion. Within days, neighbors who had previously been friendly began avoiding Samantha. Invitations to community events stopped arriving. The quarterly HOA meeting became the turning point. Samantha arrived prepared with documentation of the selective enforcement she had witnessed, including photographs of similar modifications approved for other residents and a timeline of harassment by the security team. When public comments were opened, she approached the microphone with the same calm precision she had brought to mission briefings. "Good evening," she began. "I would like to address some inconsistencies in the application of our community guidelines." She had barely finished her first point, complete with specific bylaw citations, when Margaret cut her microphone. "I am afraid we need to move on," Margaret announced to the room. While we appreciate Ms. Mitchell's enthusiasm, her concerns appear to stem from adjustment difficulties rather than actual procedural issues. Perhaps her previous experiences have created a perspective that makes community living challenging. We will have security follow up with her privately. The room fell silent. Residents avoided eye contact, their faces showing the uncomfortable recognition of injustice, but relief at not being its target. Samantha stood for a moment longer, then returned to her seat with military composure, betraying no emotion despite the public humiliation. That night, returning home from the meeting, Samantha found her garbage cans overturned across her driveway, trash scattered across her lawn. When she checked her security camera footage, it showed 2 security team members deliberately spilling the contents before driving away. The official notice in her mailbox the next morning cited her for improper waste disposal and included a $150 fine. The battle lines had now been fully drawn. Margaret Holloway had escalated from bureaucratic obstruction to active harassment. She clearly expected Samantha to either submit to her authority or give up and move away, as others had before her. What Margaret failed to understand was that she was not dealing with an ordinary resident. My daughter had navigated hostile territory under far more dangerous circumstances. She had faced actual enemies with actual weapons, not suburban tyrants with clipboards and golf carts. Instead of breaking under the pressure, Samantha began meticulously documenting every interaction, recording every encounter, and building a case that would eventually expose the entire corrupt system. She did not know yet how the confrontation would end, but her training had taught her to be prepared for any scenario. That preparation would soon prove critically important. I arrived at Samantha's house on a Friday afternoon in early November for a long-planned weekend visit. She had mentioned the HOA difficulties during our phone calls, but standing in her living room surrounded by meticulously organized documentation, I realized the situation was far more serious than she had conveyed. 3 thick binders contained photographs, dated correspondence, and recordings of interactions with the security team. A 4th held comparative evidence showing selective enforcement of community guidelines. "You should consider legal action," I suggested as she showed me an aerial photograph indicating the security patrol routes that now concentrated almost exclusively around her property. Samantha shook her head. Not yet. Everything they are doing walks a careful line. Harassment, yes, but just ambiguous enough to be denied in court. I need something definitive, something they cannot explain away. Little did we know that Margaret Holloway was about to provide exactly that opportunity. Saturday morning, Samantha received a text notification that her medical appointment had been moved up 2 hours due to a scheduling conflict. She apologized for having to leave me alone but promised to return quickly. "Help yourself to anything in the kitchen," she said as she headed out. "I should be back in 90 minutes. She had been gone barely 30 minutes when I heard vehicles pulling into the driveway. Looking through the front window, I saw 3 Oak Ridge security golf carts parked at angles that effectively blocked any exit. 3 men in those ridiculous Navy uniforms approached the front door, led by a heavy-set man whose nameplate identified him as Chief Dennis Barker. The doorbell rang, and I answered with caution, keeping the security chain engaged. Dennis informed me that they were conducting an emergency compliance inspection based on multiple reports of unauthorized modifications to the property. When I asked to see the inspection notice, he produced a document dated that morning, signed by Margaret Holloway, authorizing immediate entry based on credible concerns about structural modifications that may impact adjacent properties. Having heard enough about these tactics from Samantha, I responded calmly. "I am sorry, but the homeowner is not present. According to Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws, even emergency inspections require the presence of the homeowner unless there is immediate danger such as fire or flood. I see no such emergency, so I must ask you to reschedule when my daughter can be present." Dennis's face flushed. "Ma'am, this inspection has been authorized by the HOA president. We have full authority to enter the premises under the emergency provisions. If you obstruct this official inspection, it will result in an immediate fine and possible further sanctions." I stood my ground. "Please present the specific bylaw that grants you authority to enter without the homeowner present in a non-life-threatening situation. Until then, I must decline." The second guard stepped forward. "We have received reports of unauthorized security modifications that could interfere with HOA monitoring capabilities. That constitutes an emergency under the expanded definitions approved in the last board meeting." This was news to me. "May I see documentation of these expanded definitions?" I asked. The third guard, younger than the others and visibly uncomfortable, shifted his weight. Dennis cut off further discussion. "Ma'am, we are entering this property now as authorized. Please step aside, or we will document your interference in our official report." I held firm. "I am not moving, and you are not entering without proper authorization or the homeowner's presence. I suggest you contact her directly if this is truly an emergency." Dennis stepped closer to the door. "This is your final warning. We are entering this property now." His hand moved toward the door and I closed it completely, engaging the deadbolt. Through the door, I heard Dennis instructing the others to document this obstruction and prepare for a forced compliance entry. My hand shook slightly as I called Samantha. She answered immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, clearly hearing the tension in my voice. I explained the situation quickly. There was a brief silence. "I am already on my way home," she said. "The appointment finished early. I am 10 minutes away. Do not open the door under any circumstances. If they attempt to enter, call 911 immediately." The calm in her voice had shifted to something I recognized from her deployment days: focused, alert, operational. I watched through the window as Dennis made calls, gesturing angrily. The three men conferred, occasionally looking toward the house with obvious frustration. 15 minutes passed in this tense standoff. Then Samantha's car turned into the driveway, coming to a stop behind the security vehicles. I moved to the front door, watching through the peephole as my daughter exited her vehicle and walked with measured steps toward the three men. From her posture alone, I could tell she had shifted into a mode I had rarely seen in civilian settings. Dennis approached her immediately, clipboard extended like a shield. "Ms. Mitchell, we are conducting an authorized emergency inspection of your property. Your guest has illegally obstructed our official duties. This will result in significant fines." Samantha stopped at precisely the distance that would allow her to monitor all three men simultaneously. "Chief Barker, there is no emergency provision that allows entry without the homeowner present unless there is imminent danger to property or persons. Please show me documentation of such danger." Dennis stepped closer, invading her personal space. "The HOA president has declared this an emergency situation. That is all the authorization we require. Now step aside so we can complete our inspection." Samantha did not move. "I am requesting that you leave my property now. You may schedule a proper inspection with appropriate notice as outlined in the bylaws." The confrontation escalated quickly. Dennis's face reddened as he stepped even closer. "We are entering this property now, with or without your cooperation. Your continued obstruction will be reported to the board with a recommendation for maximum fines and possible eviction proceedings." When Samantha still did not move, Dennis made the fatal error in judgment that would ultimately bring down the entire HOA regime. His hand moved to his hip, and he drew a concealed handgun, pointing it directly at my daughter. "Stand down and step aside now," he shouted, his voice carrying across the otherwise quiet neighborhood. "This is your final warning." From my position at the door, I gasped, frozen in disbelief. In 18 years of combat operations, my daughter had faced armed enemies countless times, but never had I imagined she would be looking down the barrel of a gun in her own driveway in suburban America, held by a man whose only actual authority derived from a housing association. The neighborhood fell silent. The other two guards stepped back, clearly unprepared for this escalation. In that moment, everything changed. The petty tyranny of Oak Ridge Estates had crossed the line from harassment to criminal assault, and they had made the critical mistake of doing so to perhaps the one person in the community trained to respond. Time seemed to slow down as I watched through the window. The subtle shift in Samantha's stance would have been imperceptible to anyone without combat training. Her feet adjusted to shoulder width. Her hands remained visible at her sides, but I could see the slight tension in her fingers. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes had taken on the focused intensity I had seen only in photographs from her deployment days. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Sir, I am Samantha Mitchell, homeowner at 1423 Oak Ridge Drive. I am a retired Master Sergeant, United States Army Delta Force. You are currently committing assault with a deadly weapon on my property. Lower your firearm immediately." Dennis blinked, the gun wavering slightly in his hand. This was clearly not the response he had expected. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, quickly replaced by desperate bravado. "I do not care who you were. In Oak Ridge, I am authorized security. Back away from the property now." Samantha remained perfectly still. "You have 3 seconds to lower your weapon before I am forced to respond. 3. Dennis tightened his grip on the gun. "You do not give orders here." 2. The younger guard had backed away completely now, hands raised slightly as if to disassociate himself from what was happening. 1. Dennis made his second critical error. He gestured with the gun, waving it toward the street. "Back off or I will." He never finished the sentence. Samantha moved with a fluid precision that defied the eye to follow. One moment she was standing still, the next, Dennis was disarmed. The movement was so efficient, so economical, that it seemed almost gentle despite its effectiveness. The gun was now in Samantha's hand, magazine removed, chamber cleared, the weapon rendered safe in under 2 seconds. Dennis stared at his empty hand in disbelief. The other 2 guards remained frozen, one with his mouth literally hanging open. "Sir, please place your hands where I can see them and kneel on the ground," Samantha instructed, her voice still preternaturally calm. When Dennis failed to respond, still processing what had happened, she repeated the instruction with the same measured tone. "Sir, kneel on the ground now." Finally, his legs seemed to give way as the reality of his situation registered. He sank to his knees on the driveway. The other 2 guards began backing toward their vehicles. "All of you, please remain where you are," Samantha said. "The police have been called. You will all need to provide statements regarding this incident." I realized then that during the confrontation, I had indeed called 911, though I had been so fixated on the scene unfolding before me that I had barely registered doing so. In the distance, sirens could now be heard approaching. The younger guard found his voice. "Ma'am, I had no idea he was going to draw a weapon. That is not part of our protocol. We are not even supposed to be armed on duty." Samantha nodded once. "That will be important information for the police. Please have a seat on the lawn until they arrive." All 3 men complied now, the authority structure that had ruled Oak Ridge Estates collapsing visibly before my eyes. Dennis sat with his head in his hands, the realization of his actions seeming to settle over him like a physical weight. I stepped outside, finally able to move again. "Are you all right?" I asked my daughter quietly. Samantha nodded. "Fine, Mom. This is actually fairly straightforward compared to most situations I have handled." She placed the unloaded weapon carefully on the ground away from Dennis, then stood watchfully over the 3 men until the police arrived 3 minutes later. 2 patrol cars pulled into the driveway, officers emerging with hands near their weapons until they assessed the scene. Samantha identified herself immediately, explaining calmly that she had disarmed a man who had pointed a gun at her on her own property. She directed them to the weapon on the ground and offered to provide video evidence from her home security system. The officers separated everyone for statements. When the ranking officer learned of Samantha's military background, his demeanor shifted noticeably. After reviewing the security footage on her phone, he turned to Dennis with a coldness that matched Samantha's professional detachment. "Sir, you are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon. You have the right to remain silent." The officer continued reading Dennis his rights as he was handcuffed and placed in the police cruiser. The other 2 guards received citations for their participation in the unauthorized entry attempt, though they avoided arrest by cooperating fully with the officers. Both immediately offered information about the HOA security protocols, confirming that they were not supposed to be armed, and that Margaret Holloway had encouraged Dennis to carry a weapon despite knowing it violated both HOA guidelines and potentially state law regarding security personnel. As the police finished their initial investigation, neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They gathered at a cautious distance, witnessing the previously untouchable security force now sitting handcuffed or sighted on Samantha's lawn. Their expressions ranged from shock to what appeared to be cautious relief. One neighbor approached hesitantly. "Is it true," she asked Samantha, "were you really in Delta Force?" Samantha nodded once, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its significance in the moment. The whispers spread rapidly through the gathering crowd. The carefully constructed narrative about my daughter began to unravel as quickly as the HOA's power structure. She was not a troublemaker with adjustment issues. She was a decorated combat veteran who had defended her home against armed aggression. By the time the police departed with Dennis in custody, the balance of power in Oak Ridge Estates had shifted irreversibly. The long reign of intimidation had ended in a single afternoon because Margaret Holloway and her enforcers had chosen the wrong resident to target. They had brought a gun to a confrontation with someone trained to disarm terrorists, and the consequences of that miscalculation were only beginning to unfold. By evening, our quiet neighborhood had transformed into a hub of official activity. 2 additional police units had arrived, along with a detective from the county sheriff's department. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a section of the driveway where Dennis had drawn his weapon. Officers moved methodically through the area, taking photographs and measurements with a precision that reminded me of Samantha's own methodical approach to problems. The detective, a former military police officer named Rodriguez, reviewed the security footage repeatedly, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Ms. Mitchell," he said finally, "this is far beyond a neighborhood dispute. The weapon was brandished during an attempted illegal entry, which elevates this to a home invasion attempt with a deadly weapon. Additionally, the individual was impersonating security personnel while armed, which carries separate charges." As they continued processing the scene, Margaret Holloway arrived in a luxury SUV, parking hastily at the curb. She strode toward Samantha's house with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling every situation. Detective Rodriguez intercepted her before she could cross the police line. "Ma'am, this is an active crime scene. I need you to step back." Margaret attempted to look past him toward where Samantha and I stood providing additional statements. "I am Margaret Holloway, HOA president. These are my security officers involved in this misunderstanding. I am here to clear things up." Detective Rodriguez remained unmoved. "Ma'am, there is no misunderstanding. One of your employees has been arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. I understand you authorized today's so-called inspection." Margaret's demeanor shifted instantly, her voice lowering. "There must be some confusion. Our security team does not carry weapons. That would be against HOA policy. If Dennis had a gun, that was his personal decision and completely unauthorized." The detective consulted his notes. "Interesting. Both of the other security team members have provided statements that you specifically encouraged Mr. Barker to carry his weapon while on duty. They also indicated that you personally targeted Ms. Mitchell's property for harassment after she questioned your interpretation of HOA guidelines." Margaret's face paled. "That is absolutely false. I have never." "Additionally," the detective continued, "we have concerns about the licensing status of your security personnel. Initial checks indicate none of them possess valid security guard certifications required by state law, yet they are carrying badges that closely resemble law enforcement identification. That raises questions of fraud and impersonation." As this conversation unfolded, something remarkable began happening throughout the neighborhood. Residents emerged from their homes, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. They approached the officers, asking if they could provide statements about their experiences with the HOA security team. One by one, they began documenting years of intimidation, selective enforcement, and abuses of power. The Wilsons described having their car vandalized after questioning a fine. The Garcias produced records of being charged triple the standard rate for the same violations as board members' friends. Mrs. Peterson shared video of security vehicles shining lights into her bedroom at night after she opposed a fee increase. Detective Rodriguez assigned officers to take statements from each resident. By nightfall, the investigation had expanded dramatically. What began as a single assault charge was evolving into a wide-ranging investigation of systematic harassment, fraudulent security operations, and potential financial misconduct. Margaret made one desperate attempt to regain control. Approaching Samantha as the detective stepped away briefly, she lowered her voice to an urgent whisper. "This has gotten out of hand. If you drop the charges, I can ensure all your previous citations are removed. The board can even approve all your requested modifications. There is no need for this to go further." Samantha regarded her calmly. "Mrs. Holloway, your security chief pointed a loaded weapon at me on my own property. That is not something I can or would ignore. The legal system will handle this appropriately." Margaret's expression hardened. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. I have connections throughout this county. This will not end well for you." Detective Rodriguez returned in time to overhear the threat. "Mrs. Holloway, I suggest you refrain from anything that could be construed as witness intimidation. That would only complicate your situation further." As Margaret was escorted from the property, her carefully cultivated facade of authority had completely crumbled. The woman who had ruled Oak Ridge estates through fear and selective enforcement now found herself powerless in the face of actual legal authority. By evening's end, the detective informed us that his department would be coordinating with the district attorney's office on multiple investigations: criminal charges against Dennis, licensing violations against the security company, and potential fraud charges related to HOA fund misappropriation based on financial concerns raised by several residents. As the police finally departed, the neighborhood remained abuzz with activity. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for years now gathered in small groups, talking openly about their experiences. Something fundamental had shifted. The invisible wall of fear that had divided the community was crumbling, all because one security guard had made the mistake of pulling a gun on a woman trained to handle far more dangerous situations than a HOA dispute. In the days following the incident, Oak Ridge Estates experienced what could only be described as a peaceful revolution. The emergency board meeting called to address the situation had to be moved from the community center to the local high school gymnasium to accommodate the unprecedented attendance. Nearly every household was represented, with residents who had never before spoken at meetings now lined up at the microphones. The interim board members, hastily appointed after Margaret and two allied board members were forced to recuse themselves pending investigation, looked overwhelmed by the sudden engagement of a previously cowed community. The meeting began with a statement from the HOA attorney, who grimly outlined the legal exposure created by the security team's actions and the potential liability for every homeowner if civil suits followed. After 3 hours of public comment that revealed the full extent of the abuses under Margaret's leadership, a motion was introduced to hold emergency elections for all board positions. It passed unanimously. The date was set for 2 weeks later, barely enough time for candidates to announce their intentions and present their platforms. Samantha had no interest in HOA politics. After her military career, she wanted nothing more than quiet anonymity. But the day after the emergency meeting, she found 7 neighbors on her front porch, all urging her to run for a board position. "We need someone with integrity," Mrs. Garcia explained. "Someone who understands proper procedures but also fairness. The security issues alone require someone with your expertise to completely rebuild." Despite her reluctance, Samantha recognized that the community stood at a crucial juncture. The old regime had fallen, but without thoughtful leadership, the vacuum could be filled by similarly motivated individuals. After careful consideration, she agreed to run for the security oversight position, with the explicit goal of dismantling the current